Hello and welcome to Chapmanomics, and welcome in particular to episode 3 of our deep dive into how to answer paper 3 questions. This lesson we're looking at models and how we get from our point to our model. In previous lessons we've looked at the system as a whole and we've looked at how we get those 2 points. So if you haven't seen those videos, I recommend that you go back and you watch those videos first and then come to this one. Otherwise, maybe the system might not make a huge amount of sense for you. Also, remember to like and subscribe down below to make sure you don't miss any of these videos when they come out, because the aim of all of these is to try and get you slightly better grades in your exams. So what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to do a brief overview of the system as a whole, and then we're going to go in and look at our models. So without further ado, let's get over to the whiteboard and let's have a look at our system as a whole. Here it is, the Chapman system for answering essays. And remember, we're doing this paper backwards. We want to start with our 25 marker, then move to our shorter out questions, and then in section B, and then we want to go and move over to section A and do our 25 marker and work backwards. Remember, the reason for doing that is that we're then going to lose the smallest amount of marks if we run out of time at the end. We'll only lose maybe 5 marks or 13 marks if our 5 and our 8 marker, rather than losing a full 25 marks if we miss the 25 marker. Here's how we write those essays then. We start off, point 1, with reading the question and noting down any and all economics topics we can think of that relate to the question. Once we've got those topics, we're going to have a quick reread of the question and we're going to make sure that all of our topics fit the question we're being asked. If not, we want to cross them out on our exam paper and discard them. Number 3, we then want to find a case study or find the case study. And we're then going to cross out any of the economics topics that we've noted down in point 1 that don't fit the case study. That's the key here. We want to stay in context. We want to just be suggesting economics ideas that fit our case study closely. Once we've done that, we then want to narrow it down to just choose the 2 easiest points that we've got left. And they are then going to be the points that we're going to talk about in our essay. So just 2, you don't need any more than 2. I mean, unless the question specifically asks for just 1, in which case obviously just do 1. Or if it specifically asks for 3, then make sure you do 3. But 2 is usually absolutely fine. These first 4 points should take you only a couple of minutes to do. You shouldn't be spending a huge amount of time doing it. And therefore, the more you practice this system, the better you'll get at it. And eventually you can kind of do points 1 to 3 almost together. But to start with, make sure you're doing them separately. Once we've done that, once we've got our 2 points, we then go on to choose the models that we're going to draw, and that's what we're going to look at today, that are going to explain our points. And the key thing to do with these models is we want to show how they change, what the change is that we are suggesting is happening in our points. What that's going to do is it's going to show great knowledge, it's going to show how those models, that we know how those models work, and it's going to give us some context marks because we're explaining it in terms of the case study. Then we're going to look at our model and we're going to look at our points and we're going to find some evaluation from it. We're going to think what in the real world might mean that our analysis or our model doesn't happen in quite as neat a way as the theory here is suggesting. After that, we're then going to plan our essay using the Chapman structure that I'm going to teach you in a future video. 7 points, remember those points, and you shouldn't really be going too far wrong. Now, let's have a look at how we put point 5 into practice. Here we go then. Point 5. What models would you draw and what change would you show? I'm going to put up a series of questions here and it's going to be up to us together to work out what our model should be based on the suggested points that I am recommending. I'm going to not give you too much time in this video because otherwise it's going to go on too long. But what I'd recommend you do is that once I put up the question and once I tell you what the 2 points are, they are going to be up on the whiteboard. But once I do that, I'd recommend you pause the video and see if you can come up with the models yourself first. That way you're practicing your knowledge, you're practicing your understanding, and that will also really improve your grades. Let's look at the first question. We've looked at this question before. This is to evaluate the macro and micro effects of a depreciation in the pound. Refer to restaurants or other food delivery services in your answer. So what I've done is I've gone through that system of points 1 to 4, and I've come up with the two economics ideas, the two economics concepts that I would like to talk about in this essay, and I've done that bit for you. If you want to see how to do that, remember, go back to the previous video and you'll find it. So point 1 is higher costs for firms of food imports reduces profits for firms. So when we have a depreciation of the pound, that pushes up the price of imports, and as a result, for our restaurateurs, that's going to push up the price of imported food. Point 2, higher costs of food imports causes inflation. And I'm suggesting that because food is a massive big part of the basket of goods. And therefore, it affects supermarkets, it affects restaurants, it affects everything we eat pretty much. And therefore, if we are depreciation in the pound, we're importing half of our food, and that's down here in the case study. And as a result, it's probably going to cause some level of inflation, some cost push inflation. So pause the video now, give this a go for yourself, and then we can go through it together. Let's look together. The way I would approach this is I'm going to look at my points and I'm going to see, is there a model that is being teased out within those points? Is there some way I can look at this and say, there's a model? And to give you an example of this, I'm going to take point 1 here and I'm going to look at this idea here of higher costs. So higher costs says to me, well, what model do I know that includes costs? And I think a cost revenue model includes costs. Do I know any others? Well, here we're looking at profit. So I think this cost and revenue model, that shows profit if I remember rightly, and therefore cost and revenue seems good here. There's another option here where I can talk about higher costs and reducing profit perhaps, and that's our supply and demand model. But if I look at my point here, going back over this, there's not a huge amount about demand here. Instead, it's mostly about profits. And so therefore, and costs for firms. So therefore, I'm going to scrub that one. I'm going to say costs and revenue for this first model. Our second model here, we are looking at higher cost of food causing inflation. Well, higher cost again, but I know that I need a macro point, and this one here is a micro point. So therefore, I'm going to look at something else. So higher cost of food imports causes inflation. Well, I now have two choices because I have two models that are going to very clearly show inflation. I've either got a Keynesian model or I've got a classical model of the economy. And therefore I now get to choose between the two. Now for me, I always love a Keynesian model. I'd always recommend that you do Keynesian over classical if you have the choice to, because you just have a little bit more to talk about. You can talk about whether or not we're on the elastic part of that long run aggregate supply curve or on the inelastic part or on the bit where it curves up a little bit, and therefore we're utilizing our resources to the max. You've got just that little bit more to talk about, I think. But if you're more comfortable with the classical model, absolutely go for the classical model. So for me here, I'm going to scrub my classical and I'm going to go for Keynesian. And now what I've done is I've narrowed down all the possible models to just these two, and I can now go and draw them out, which we're going to do here. So, higher costs of food imports reduces profit for firms. Pause the video now if you haven't got this model already. Pause it now and see if you can give it a go as to what this model might look like. Here's my version then. I'm going to draw my axes in first, and I'm going to make sure that on the y-axis I've got my cost and revenue, and on my x-axis I've got my quantity. That's how we know we're looking at a microeconomics point. Then I'm going to draw a nice low marginal cost curve, and I'm going to call this marginal cost 1, and then I'm going to draw in my average cost, and again I'm going to do that nice and low in average cost 1, remembering that marginal cost always goes through the bottom of average cost. Next I'm going to put in my average revenue curve, which is also equal to the demand curve the firm faces. If you don't know any of this, it's probably a good idea to go and have a recap. And then I'm going to put in my marginal revenue curve, which is going to fall below 0 at some point. Now I have the basis of this cost and revenue model. I can start to put in just a few little extra tidbits that are going to really get me some good marks. So I'm going to assume that these restaurant firms are going to be profit maximizing. That's what I'm going to assume it. Now, I'm also assuming that this market is some kind of monopolistic competition market, and it's not perfect competition. I think that's kind of a reasonable thing to do here, because we're suggesting these are restaurants in local towns. It's unlikely maybe to have exactly the same restaurant that's selling homogenous goods. We can talk about that in your analysis perhaps. But it's unlikely that you're going to get, say, 2 fish and chip restaurants directly next to each other that are selling exactly the same type of fish and chips, and that are essentially have the same branding and all the rest of it. So it's a bit unlikely. So therefore, we're okay with a bit of monopolistic competition. And then I'm going to put in my price. This is my P1, and I'm going to put in my average cost 1, 2. So I'm going to assume that our firm here is profit maximizing, and then I'm going to put in a quantity of Q1 as well. Next, I now have my basic model here, but I want to show something changing because I want to show that I've got that great knowledge, and I want to show that I can put that knowledge into context. And so I'm saying that the price is going to rise. So therefore what I want is I want a new average cost curve here. So we're going to go AC2, which is going to give me a new marginal cost curve, which is slightly higher, of MC2. And as a result, what I'm showing here is I'm showing the change between food prices before and food prices after that depreciation of the pound. Now I can get in a second average cost point, so AC2 over here. And what I can now show is I can show that profit before, so supernormal profit before, is P1 over here, P1, A, B, AC1. So it represents this area here. That is our profit before, because it's the amount of profit that you make per unit, the difference between your cost and the revenue you're getting in for every single unit. And if you remember your geometry, a width times a length gives an area. And so therefore all we're doing is we're taking the profit from each unit. Each one of these lines represents a unit, and that's the profit from each unit. So therefore P1, A, B, AC1 shows us our supernormal profit before, then our SMP after the change. Well, we could, if we wanted to, put in the new profit maximizing point. However, I'm going to suggest we don't really need to here, because what we want to show is we want to show that profit is falling at that point. And I'm kind of going to assume a bit of ceteris paribus here, that actually the firm decides to still produce at the same quantity, particularly in the short run. We don't need to worry too much about this, but what we could suggest is that the firm was profit maximizing at this point of Q1, and after the change, they simply choose to profit satisfice, which is where they effectively say, this is enough profit for us to make. And so what I'm going to suggest then is that instead of supernormal profit being P1, AB, AC1, instead we're going to put a nice C in. So that C, if you missed it, just went in here. And now we've got a supernormal profit after of P1, AC, AC2. And now I can talk about this area of supernormal profit before being larger than this area of supernormal profit afterwards. And I've explained now what's happened as a result of this depreciation in the pound. I've explained that profits have gone from this area here to this area here. And I can talk about that on our model. Great context, great application. Next, higher cost of food imports causing inflation. Well, we said we were going to look at a Keynesian model here. So we therefore want to have our price level at the top, and we want to have output, or Y, or whatever it is that you draw for output, on our x-axis. This immediately says to your examiner that this is a macro point. So the model on this side here says this is micro, and the model on this side here now says macro. So Keynesian curve. We'll drop that in. See if this will do it nice and neatly for me. Just about. Let's top that off up here. So here's our long run aggregate supply curve. Something like a bit like this. Here is our aggregate demand curve, AD. And here we have our Y1 and our PL1. Now remember, what we want to show here is we want to show inflation happening as a result of cost push, right? As a result of costs increasing. Therefore, the change we want to show is going to be something along the lines of this. So here's our LRAS2. This is LRAS1. And we get to a new output point of Y2, but we're not as fussed with that output point as we are with our price level increasing. And this is the bit that we want to be super, super clear about here. We don't need to worry too much about output because of the point that we're making. If we were to say that this depreciation, of the pound, increase in the price of imports was causing economic growth to fall, then that's what we talk about there, but we want to be really, really clear about this price point. So these are the two models that I would draw in this case. And just to show you them a little bit more clearly, if you need to pause the video and have a little recap, here they are a little bit more clearly. Then perhaps this drawing is a little bit cumbersome to look at. Here they are a bit more clearly. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing that shift up in average cost, that change in marginal cost as a result here, and then the change in costs, and so therefore the fall in this, and I would do my A, my B, and my C here. And then here we're seeing that long run aggregate supply shifting and the price level increasing from PL1 to PL2. Remember, AD here, not shifting at all. Okay, that's how we look through and we try and figure out our models. Let's do another question together, and then I'm going to leave you guys a couple of questions to do on your own. So here's another question. Evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of significant increases in the minimum wage. Now, just as a slight aside here and a bit of exam technique for you, this word significant is very, very important to this question. An insignificant change isn't going to really do very much, so therefore we're really talking about pushing up that minimum wage. Refer to restaurants and other food delivery services in your answer. So I've gone through and I've picked out 2 points for you. A rise in the national minimum wage will worsen, because it's a significant increase in it, it will worsen excess supply of hospitality workers. Point 2, increasing the national minimum wage will reduce inequality in the UK. Pause the video and see if you can come up with the two models that would show these 2 points and the change that is being suggested within them. Pause that video now. Okay, if you didn't do it, if you just simply carried on the video, I really do recommend you pause the video and test your own knowledge. It's only you, hopefully, it might only be only you in the room, so there's no reason to be shy. And even if it's not just you in the room, actually getting it wrong and asking someone for help is a really, really great way of learning. It's basically the only way we learn. Otherwise, we just simply know it already. So do give it a try. And if you haven't paused the video, pause it now. Let's have a look at what two models we could possibly draw here. So the first one, we're talking about a rise in national minimum wage is going to create an excess supply of hospitality workers. So again, we're looking at here a quantity and we're looking at a wage because we're looking at national minimum wage. And this says immediately to the examiner, once again, this is a micro point. So we therefore need our supply of hospitality workers and we need a demand for hospitality workers too. So there's our supply and demand. We can put in then our quantity at equilibrium and our price. Our wage at equilibrium. Goodness, not our price. We definitely want a wage at equilibrium. Don't have a price of workers. So now what we want to do is we want to put in our minimum wage. So here is our national minimum wage. And we want to call this national minimum wage 1 because remember we want to show that change. And then we're going to have a quantity supplied 1 and a quantity demanded 1. And remember we were talking about that significant change here. So we want to really push up our national minimum wage really nice and high to give a national minimum wage 2. And here we're going to get a quantity supplied 2 and a quantity demanded 2. And this is going to be showing that change that we were talking about. So the change is that increase, significant increase in the minimum wage. And we can then point out what it's doing to supply. So supply has gone from our quantity equilibrium here, where the market is simply working itself out, to a quantity supplied 1 when the first national minimum wage was implemented, to a second quantity supplied when this national minimum wage increased significantly. And this arrow is the only one we really need here because that's all we're going to talk about is that increase in excess supply. We can talk about there being a big difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied if we want to. We can even draw a nice big arrow between the two. But really, I'm just going to talk about, because we're talking about that significant increase, I'm going to talk about the difference between here and here compared to, I might talk about these a little bit. So there's our model that we can draw. The second one, increasing national minimum wage will reduce inequality in the UK. Let's do this in a different colour. Now, the only model I can think of to draw here is the only one I know about inequality, and that is our Lorenz curve. So therefore, we're going to have the percentage of total. Now, we have a choice here. It's either total wealth or total income. Now, because we're talking about a minimum wage, I think that's going to be income, because we're not talking about changes in wealth here. And then it's going to be percentile of the population. And these are on our two axes. Now, we're talking about macro because we're talking about inequality across the whole of the UK here. And we're talking about micro on this side here because we have our wage and our quantity. Now, let me think about this model. It's a tough one, I think, for students to remember because you don't touch on it that much. But remember, we have our line of perfect equality. And that's what would happen if our wage, if the income, of the country was to be equally distributed among percentiles. So the bottom 10% would have 10% of income, the bottom 20% would have 20% of income, and so on and so forth. And now what we're saying is that this is going to reduce inequality in the UK. So therefore, my Lorenz curve, I'm going to do a nice big bow to it like this, my initial Lorenz curve, L1. And what that's showing is that there's a lot of inequality going on between our Lorenz curve and our line of perfect equality here. Then I'm going to draw a second Lorenz curve, which is showing that the national minimum wage is reducing inequality. So there's our L2 curve. And what we're going to do is draw a nice arrow to make sure we're really showing that examiner that we know that this is causing a shift in of our Lorenz curve. So it's getting closer to that line of inequality. And if you remember, the gap between these two, gap between the line and the line of perfect equality, if you integrate it for those mathematicians out there, you end up with the Gini coefficient. So therefore, we can talk about our Gini coefficient is smaller for L2 than L1. And that's what is representing that change. Just as a very, very quick recap, increase in national minimum wage, great way of reducing inequality because you're taking the profits that firms are gaining. Those profits mostly go to wealthier owners, and you are giving them in the form of higher wages to workers at the very bottom end of the wage scale. Not only that, but you're then also probably pushing up the wages of those who are just slightly above national minimum wage because they're going to want to keep that difference between their job and national minimum wage kind of jobs. It's a really, really useful way of reducing inequality in the UK. Or in any other country, to be honest, as well, if they don't have minimum wage or if they need to increase it. Again, look at your point and try and pick out from your point what would be the key ideas. So national minimum wage and excess supply, that tells me that this is the model that I want to be drawing. Reducing inequality tells me this is the model I want to be drawing. Your point should really inform what model you're going to draw and should also inform the change. A rise in the national minimum wage, well, that means we need to show national minimum wage increasing. Reducing inequality, well, that means we need to show that our L1 curve is shifting in. If it was to say we were increasing inequality, well, that would be then going the other way, and therefore this is how we show that context. Okay, there's the two models a little bit more neatly for you. You can pause the video and recap them if you need to. And I'm going to leave you with this question here. This is going to be purely for you to do. I'm not going to do this one with you. With reference to extract C, discuss the likely effects of increasing integration within the food delivery market. Here are your 2 points. Point 1, increasing integration will generate economies of scale for Deliveroo. Point 2, increasing market power for consumers, for Deliveroo increases prices for consumers. There's your 2 points, and it's up to you to see if you can draw the two models. Pause the video now and see if you can work out what those models will be. As I say, I'm not going to go through this one with you. Instead, I'm just going to show you the two models that I would draw. So I would draw this economies of scale model, moving from point A to our minimum efficient scale. If you don't know this model, have a recap of it, look through your notes and make sure you recap it. And I'd also draw a cost and revenue model again, because now we're looking at increasing market power, increases prices for consumers. And this firm has gone from a revenue max point, which also happens to be allocatively efficient, to a profit max point, which is increasing prices for consumers. And so that's how I'm showing that change. Hopefully this all makes a lot of sense to you as to how we develop those models from our points. If it doesn't, drop me a comment down below with any questions that you've got, and I'm more than happy to try to answer them. I will try to answer them in good time. Hopefully the system is now becoming a little clearer to you too, that we find those points, we narrow it down to just two using the case study and using the question, and then we look at how we put together our models. In our next lesson, we're going to go through and look at how we develop our evaluative points from our model and from our points. that we've made. And then finally, we're going to look at a decent essay structure for those of you who are struggling to actually write these essays out. Again, hopefully it's clear and hopefully you've enjoyed these videos so far. And I will see you on the next one.